Hello, and welcome to this ARA webinar with staff from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Today's webinar will include information regarding the recent nurse tank safety advisory issued by FMCSA and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Presenters will discuss the safety advisory in detail, as well as the types of tests recommended by the advisory. The webinar will also include information on what to do if a nurse tank fails, one of these tests, and how to repair a nurse tank. My name is Hunter Carpenter, Senior Director of Public Policy and with the Agricultural Retailers Association, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in just a bit. But first, I'll go over a few things so you know what to expect. First, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway, provide a great opportunity for ARA member companies to help educate their employees. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel at any time. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be added to the members-only section of the ARA website. As a reminder, you can log into the member-only ARA dashboard to access past webinar recordings, and if you do not have an ARA login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. So with that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our speakers, Jessica Stiles, Alex Chang, and Leonard Majors. Jessica is the Hazmat Program Manager for the Midwestern Service Center with FMCSA. She has nearly 2 decades of experience with all types of HM's transportation, including cargo tanks and nurse tanks. Alex is an engineer with FMCSA. He has subject matter expertise in structural integrity for both bulk and non-bulk packaging, and he currently sits as a committee member for American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Section 12. Leonard Majors is an engineer with FMCSA. He has subject matter expertise in the development and evaluation of bulk package standards. He is the FMCSA representative for the Association of American Railroads and Tank Car Committee and is a member of the Canadian General Standards Board. So with that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Just so you know, Hunter, it doesn't let the video show, which is perfectly fine. I'm great with no video being shown. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jessica Stiles. As you mentioned, I'm with Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I am the Midwest Hazmat Program Manager, and I'm also on detail to headquarters currently. As the Midwest Program Manager, I get to deal with nurse tanks all the time. We see them all the time in the Midwest. And I also had a hand in bringing this issue to light and helping the team write the safety advisory that we're going to discuss today. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in this webinar today. We're going to cover what are nurse tanks, safety advisory. We're going to talk about it in detail for you so that we can go through and hopefully answer any questions that you have. Our engineers here are going to discuss what to do if the tank fails a test or inspection and what kinds of repairs, how you can make repairs if they're even authorized. So let's jump into what are nurse tanks. Every one of you knows what a nurse tank is, right? You're going to see that you know exactly what a nurse tank is. So when I say what is a nurse tank, I'm being very particular here with regulatory what is a nurse tank. How does a nurse tank fit into the hazmat regulations that are written by FMCSA and enforced by FMCSA? And so we pulled this straight out of the regulation, 49 Code of Federal Regulations 173.315, paragraph M. I will say that you can find this regulation either in your reg book or you can find it online at www.ecfr.gov. You can find any regulations that we discuss. I'm going to put that in the chat for you too, so that it is there. Although I think, Hunter, I just shared it to you. If you can share it to the group, that'd be great. Okay, so let's talk about what is a nurse tank. According to the regulations, a nurse tank is an implement of husbandry, transporting anhydrous ammonia. It's operated by a private carrier exclusively for agricultural purposes. We all know what they look like. You've got a picture of one right there. Nurse tanks are accepted from specification packaging requirements if they meet all this criteria. I'm just going to briefly run through for you. Now, what does that mean? What that means is we're saying normally by the regulations, anhydrous ammonia has to be in a specification DOT cargo tank, an MC331, MC330, that kind of thing. This exception here is saying we're not going to make you put it in a specification cargo tank as long as you meet all of this criteria. If you fail to meet any one of these criteria for that tank, this exception is no longer granted and it is an unauthorized package. So pay close attention, and you can always double check your tanks and just make sure they meet this criteria. So a nurse tank has to have a minimum design pressure of 250 PSIG. It has to be marked with a valid ASME plate, with some exceptions we'll talk about in a minute. In general, it has to be marked with a valid ASME plate. Has to be equipped with pressure relief valves per the Compressed Gas Association CGA standards. It's going to be painted white or aluminum. Normally we see them white. They're not so often aluminum, but they can be painted that color. Has to have a capacity of 3,000 gallons or less. Keep in mind this is per tank that we're discussing here. The tank has to have a capacity of 3,000 gallons or less. When it is loaded, it has to be loaded to a filling density of 56% or less. Has to be securely mounted on a farm wagon or on a field truck, and there's extra requirements we're not going to go into today for a field truck, but you can look those up at ecfr.gov in this section. And it has to conform with Part 172. So Part 172 of the regulations is our communication standards. That's where we discuss security plans. It's where we discuss shipping papers, placards, labels, markings, all of the required information to communicate to first responders what is being hauled in that tank. So it has to conform with the requirements in Part 172, except that you don't need shipping papers. And the one end that has those valves, fittings, regulators, it doesn't need markings or placards when those appurtenances, when those valves and fittings, etc., prevent them from being properly displayed. If a placard can be displayed, it needs to be on there. If it can't be properly displayed, then you have that option to utilize that exception. If the ASME plate is missing or illegible, that is still authorized as a nurse tank. However, at that point, certain tank tests and inspections will be required every few years. We're going to discuss, Alex will discuss in more detail what tests and inspections are required for nurse tanks that don't have an ASME plate. We'll get to that in a little bit. So this is regulatory, what we see as a nurse tank per the regulations. Let's go ahead and go on to the next one. Now let's talk about this safety advisory that was issued earlier this year. And I believe the next slide has a link here. We are going to click on it in a moment so that I can read through it. There is a QR code you can scan that will bring you straight to that website. That way you can access it. And we're going to put the QR code again at the end of the presentation so that you will see it there as well. And if you can click on it now and show it on the screen, we'll read through that advisory together. All right, so nurse tank safety advisory. We issued this in February of 2024 after an incident in Iowa came to our attention. We with FMCSA, this was a joint effort between the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and FMCSA, Pipeline and Hazmat Safety Administration, to issue this safety advisory about nurse tanks. If you can scroll down a little bit, that would be great. I'll read through the background with them here. So the background. This notice focuses on nurse tanks that are manufactured from January 1, 2007 through December 31, 2011 by American Welding and Tank at its Fremont, Ohio plant. This is very specific, isn't it? And that's because we identified issues with the weld procedures when these tanks were made. And so those are the tanks that we're seeing start to fail now. You can always use this information to apply it to other nurse tanks. For this presentation, we're focusing on the AWT ones in this specific year group, but you can use this information for other tanks as well. I will say that I believe how to identify that it was made at the Fremont, Ohio plant. I believe those serial numbers begin with a 4 on that one. I can double check, but I believe it's an AWT tank, January 1, 2007 through December 31, 2011. And I think they're going to start with a 4. And that way you can tell they were at the Fremont, Ohio plant. So nurse tanks manufactured from 2009 to 2010 had an investigation where we found these issues. So in 2023, a 2009 AWT nurse tank containing anhydrous ammonia, I like that we say experienced a catastrophic failure. It blew up. It was just sitting there in a lot. People were in the office and this tank blew. Luckily, the resulting cloud did not affect the daycare that wasn't too far away, thank goodness, and nobody was injured. But it was just sitting there. It wasn't being hauled down the road and it just went. The failure caused the tank shell to rocket over 300 feet from its original location. It ricocheted off of some other tanks too. And it brought to light these issues with the AWT tanks. As a result of the incident, the owner of the nurse tank contracted with a third-party testing company to examine their AWT nurse tanks that were made between 2008 and 2012. Kudos to the company for trying to figure out which ones might have problems and which ones need to be dealt with. They did some radiographic testing, X-ray type testing, radiographic testing. 7 of the 8 nurse tanks had extreme stress, corrosion, cracking, porosity, and inclusions and voids in the welds where the heads and the shells were joined. Only the 2012 tank passed, which was after we visited them and they identified their issues and they fixed things. So the owner sent those results to engineering experts with FMCSA, and they determined that they wanted to put those tanks out of service. And they conducted more testing, radiographic testing on another 142 tanks, and 100 failed that test. All 2012 tanks passed. So the issues were corrected after 2011. Let's keep reading the recommendations, and I'm going to talk through the recommendation, but our engineers here, Leonard and Alex, will cover this in detail in a few slides. So we're going to cover this a little more. So currently, as you're all aware, the hazmat regulations don't require any kind of periodic inspection and testing of nurse tanks that have valid plates on them, as long as they meet all the criteria in the regulations. The requirements for periodic inspection and testing only apply when ASME plate is missing or illegible. I do see a question in the comments in the chat that is asking, is PHMSA and FMCSA considering a requirement that all nurse tanks considered to be in service be tested, whether they have a legible ASME data plate or not? I will say that is on the radar. Any such rulemaking would take years, and we would have to get input from all of you as well. We would have to issue a request for information or an advance notice to gather some more information from you and figure out what all of you would like to see as well and what kind of cost that would be to the businesses. It is on the radar. We have talked for years about how we can make improvements to nurse tanks. So at the end of this, you'll see our contact info. And if anyone has suggestions or ideas or comments, I would suggest probably forward them to Leonard or Alex, because PHMSA makes the regulations. We just enforce them at FMCSA. And we'd be glad to forward any questions on. I think that was a very good question. And I'm sorry, Richard, I can't tell sometimes in this chat if it's going to everyone, if everyone can see that question, or if that was just directed at me. My apologies if that was, if I said anything wrong on how that was worded. Okay, so continuing on. We strongly recommend, please note the wording here, strongly recommend. We can't require it because it's not a regulation, but we strongly recommend that owners of AWT nurse tanks that are manufactured between that date range we discussed, that are currently exempted from periodic inspection and testing requirements because they have the valid ASME plates, which is why you know they're AWT tanks, right? We're recommending that you conduct voluntary periodic visual inspections, thickness testing, and pressure testing in accordance with the regulations. If you're unable to conduct voluntary pressure testing, we're recommending that either radiographic or ultrasonic testing be conducted. And the period of voluntary inspection and testing is going to be at the discretion of the nurse tank owner. We recommend at least once every 5 years, which is consistent with the requirements currently for nurse tanks. So we will talk some more about that in a couple of slides. And you know, a question that often comes up too is whether the agency has seen more failures more recently. for newer nurse tanks versus older nurse tanks, and I might leave that to FMCSA to talk about here in a minute. I would say that we've seen issues with newer tanks, we've seen issues with all types of nurse tanks. We technically don't regulate the manufacturer of nurse tanks. It's an exception. If it's an ASME plate, we don't actually have a spec plate or anything like that that we require to be on there, just the ASME data plate. So that makes it a little bit tough sometimes to track some of the statistics here. I would say in this particular case, it's obviously the older nurse tanks that have issues, the 2007, I should say, through the date range, because they fixed things after that date. You're asking if I see in the chat, can we get new data plates for good tanks and where? You would have to follow, if it's an ASME tank, you have to follow ASME requirements for data plates. Oftentimes if you see that one is starting to get illegible and you want to replace it, you can generally reach out to the manufacturer of the tank and they will send you a new specification plate. Now, if the spec plate's already gone, sorry, I say specification plate, my apologies, ASME data plate. If the data plate's already gone and it's been gone for a while, there are no procedures to recertify this back up to code and get a new plate. If it's gone, it's just gone. But if it's starting to get illegible, I definitely recommend reaching out to the owner, the manufacturer, and seeing about getting a new plate for that tank. That way you can keep it going with a good plate. We can go ahead and go back to the presentation. And as I said, you'll be able to see this QR code again at the end along with the link as well, so that you can get it again. And now at this point, now that I've told you what nurse tanks are and about the safety advisory, I do believe I'm going to pass it off to Alex. Let me see if I'm correct, if we can go, yes, tests and inspections. Alex is now going to discuss tests and inspections with you. Go
Great.
ahead, Alex.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Chang. I'm going to be discussing a little bit about tests and inspections with y'all guys. Next slide. So right now, just to kind of reiterate what Jessica's been harping on, is that if you currently have a valid ASME plate, there is no required periodic testing or inspection. But we kind of also want to point out is that some of the local jurisdictions, they may have different requirements or laws that, in addition to based on the area, you may have to reach out to them to see if there's any additional requirements. Next slide. So right now, currently, testing and inspections are only required if you are missing or having legible ASME plates. Generally, they are required every 5 years. There's the visual, the thickness, and the pressure testing. And it's important to know that, these are just kind of minimum requirements. You can do more if you want, but it is definitely a requirement that if it's missing or legible, you have to go do all those 3 tests. Next slide. So just kind of reiterate based on the safety advisory, the tanks that were discovered between January 1st, 2007 and December 31st of 2011 for the AW nurse tanks, we highly and strongly suggest that you do at least the VT and P. The reason why is because there's just poor welding quality on those tanks, and from testing done, it seems like those exist only for that certain range of tanks that were constructed. And if you can't do the pressure testing, we also think it's a good thing to do either the radiographic or ultrasonic testing in kind of lieu of pressure testing. Basically, this slide is saying any testing is better than no testing. So next slide. So a little bit about test inspections and failures. So when do failures kind of happen? What constitutes a failure? For a visual, it's pretty somewhat obvious. Usually there's kind of like a bulging on the nurse tank. If you notice any dents, gouges, corrosion, pitting, that's very easy to kind of pick up. And these are really telltale signs to basically say, stop work, take action, see if there's any other issues with the tank. So this is in accordance with 180-407. In fact, I think 180-407B1 kind of give you the criteria for the types of things to kind of look for in visual. Now, there's also so for failure in thickness testing, it depends on the volume of the nurse tank. So as the regs say, if it's less than 1,500 gallons, there's a minimum head thickness of 203 mils and a minimum of 239 mils for the shell. And then if you have a greater capacity than 1,500, then the thickness is a little bit more. It's 250 mils as a minimum. And just to kind of point this out is, let's say if you do decide to do a thickness test, even with the plate, just make note that if the thickness measurements that come out from that test is less than what is cited on the ASME data plate, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fail. And the reason why is because ASME in their data plate is only using nominal thickness, whereas the thickness is measuring the minimum thicknesses. So more information kind of may be needed. You may have to reach out to the manufacturer, or if you are very good in record keeping, you would be able to produce, and usually the manufacturer provides a report for you to kind of look over, say what the minimum thickness calculations are. So I think next up is Leonard talking about nurse tank repairs. I'll pass it off to Leonard.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leonard Majors, and I will be talking about nurse tank repairs. Let's start by saying what we mean by repair. So we're referencing a repair to the pressure vessel. That means the tank's head and shell. So we're not talking about any repairs to attachments or appurtenance to the tank. This is strictly welding, specifically to the head and shell. All right. Before you begin any repair, I recommend that you check with your local jurisdiction to confirm if a nurse tank repair or alteration is authorized. Some jurisdictions don't allow repairs, so I would think you should check with them first. Secondly, the nurse tank must have been constructed to the ASME code section 8, and this is per 49 CFR 173-315M. Next, it must have an attached and legible nurse ASME plate. And third, and finally, we recommend that you follow CGA 2.1/2003, the requirements for storage and handling of anhydrous ammonia, the 7th edition. Just to focus on attached and legible, there are plates that are attached, but you can't read them, so that makes them illegible. And I'll get into illegible and not attached nurse tanks in the next slide, please. All right, nurse tanks that cannot be repaired. As I mentioned, illegible or missing ASME plates on a nurse tank, you cannot repair that tank per the 49 CFR 173-315. Unauthorized repairs on a nurse tank will place it out of service. That means I'll get into detail on how you should repair it or who should repair it later in the presentation. But if you having a repair that's done outside the normal, it will put the tank out of service. And I also want to caution everyone, be aware when you're buying or selling or disposing of a nurse tank with a missing or illegible plate, because you can sometimes not know the history on that tank. And if that tank has been tested per the HMR for missing an illegible ASME plate, it may not have been marked properly. So this is a caution to be aware of. Next slide, please. All right, so how to perform a repair. So repairs, they must be done in accordance with the National Board Inspection Code, Supplemental 6. You should follow that code when you take your tank to a facility. They should be using that code, and they also should have an R stamp. And the R stamp means that they are registered and authorized through NBIC to perform repairs on pressure vessels. Next slide, please. What you should provide the R stamp facility, if you should provide them with the manufacturer's data report. The MDR will tell the R stamp facility how the tank was made. The MDR is normally a U1A form, and there's a picture of it down on the bottom of the slide of what a U1A form would look like. The R stamp facility may review the ASME plate for additional information, such as thicknesses, material of construction, things of that nature. And the R stamp facility will use all this information as well as their expertise to determine what type of repair should be performed. It could be something as simple as an cosmetic, looking at a dent, checking its depth, see if it's critical. It could be doing a full well repair. It could be an alteration. So the R stamp facility will take care of that part. Next slide, please. So some documentation and record keeping that you should receive after repair is performed. The R stamp facility will give you some documentation telling you what repair was performed, how they performed it, what materials used. So you will get a form. They will apply an additional plate to the tank, and it's down here at the bottom of the slide, and it will be marked with the R stamp. And the ASME original nameplate will remain on the tank after the repair. So you go to the facility, you get your repair, and you had one plate, and you'll come back out with 2 plates after the repair is completed. And we recommend that tank owners maintain these records for any tanks that have been repaired. Next slide, please. So just to summarize everything we've discussed during this presentation, we walked you through and defined what a nurse tank is per 49 CFR 173-315M. We talked about the Joint DOT FMCSA FMCSA Safety Advisory about the AWT nurse tanks. We talked about what to do if tanks fail in inspections and the different types of inspections of a nurse tank we recommend for a nurse tank, and what tests and inspections are required for a nurse tank with a missing or illegible plate. And we talked about how to repair a nurse tank if it's authorized. So this concludes our presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Hunter for opening it up for the Q&A.
Can I jump in here, Hunter, real quick?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks. Yeah, so part of our goal with this was to have a good discussion and answer your questions. We wanted to give you the background and then answer all the questions you might have about nurse tanks. So you've got us here. This is a great time to ask them. I do want to mention a correction. AWT nurse tanks that were manufactured at the Fremont plant, they should have a number 6 at the start of the serial number. I do believe I said 4 earlier, but it is a number 6 that should be at the start of the serial number. I double checked that. You have our contact information here on the screen. Also the QR code that gets you to a neat brochure by FMCSA for agricultural products, and also the QR code and the link that will get you to the safety advisory that we've discussed today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Hunter, and we are here to hopefully answer any nurse tank questions you have. Bring them on.
Great, thanks. We do have a few questions, so I'll read them in order as they were received. Can we find more information regarding the incorrect weld procedures to better understand the failure? It sounds like a combination of in-service damage and fabrication defects.
I'm looking right now, Leonard and Alex, I'm looking right now to see the safety advisory mentioned a couple of minor things, but go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so I was looking at the safety advisory. It doesn't seem as though it's clear on what the cause was, but I suspect, you know, if you were to look at the safety advisories, one of the things they mention is stress corrosion cracking. They notice that there's some porosity in the weld metal. And my guess is this is very typical of the tanks being welded too fast, or there's a knot, or they're using too high of a heat input. Those are like one of the big two things that, in the welding world, you have to be careful of, especially with, uh, putting two pieces of metal together. If you weld it too fast, you could potentially get all these areas where things don't fuse together, which is likely causing that stress corrosion cracking. Or there's the cleanliness, that's also the thing. It's hard to tell because it doesn't go into that much detail, unfortunately. But those are my suspicions of why it's occurring.
Next question. What if the manufacturer is no longer in business? Can I still get a data plate replacement?
Alex or Leonard, any thoughts on that one? That might fall more under ASME code there.
Yeah, I think that's more of a ASME question. But from my understanding and experience is that a manufacturer would be hesitant to do that because they would have to, their use stamp would be responsible for a tank that they didn't build. So from my experience, I think that tank would fall under the missing and the illegible realm.
And I tend to agree, Leonard, too. And what you could be thinking of, for example, if any of you have 406, 331s, any other DOT specification cargo tanks, we do have separate regulations related to those because they're DOT specification. So we do have requirements on there for ways that you can recertify a tank that doesn't have a spec plate anymore, or how to get one, or how to recertify. Nurse tanks, unfortunately, it's an exception to our regulation. It is not a DOT specification, and they're built to ASME code. So I tend to agree with Leonard there that if the plate's missing, it's missing. If the manufacturer's out of business, I don't know that you'll be able to get a new one. But if the manufacturer is still in business and you still have the plate, you can probably track it down by serial number then.
Next question. What information could be missing to constitute illegibility?
Another good question. I'd say personally, any of the information that's required by ASME to be on the ASME data plate, and Leonard or Alex, you might have more experience with that. But if it's a requirement to be on that data plate and it's not there and you can't read it, I think that would be where our issues would come in. Very especially the use stamp, the serial, anything that's actually required, the design pressure, anything that we need to see. What do you think, Leonard or Alex?
Yeah, I think it would be something with if you don't have it matching or it's kind of illegible compared to the U1A form, because usually that's what the minimum requirements, the marking is, or minimum information. But yeah, I think if it doesn't have that minimum information, any of it, it's probably going to be illegible, unfortunately.
One attendee said they had 40 AWT tanks in that span of production, and 25 out of the 40 had cracking, and they're in the process of repairs. If AWT tanks in the time frame mentioned are a concern, wouldn't it be better to do the ultrasonic testing rather than a pressure test in the safety testing process?
So I guess I can take that question. One of the things that you have to understand about testing is that there's not really one test that can cover everything that could be a problem. So, for example, for UT and RT, they're really good at detecting defects. So for UT, it's anywhere on the order between like 1/10 of an inch up to 100th of an inch for the smallest defect that it can find.
And Alex,
RT,
UT being the thickness test, right?
no, that's the ultrasonic
Ultrasonic,
testing.
sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. So these are the same types of tests, but one has higher fidelity. So typically for the radiographic testing, you can get up to anywhere between the smallest defect size, about 100th of an inch to 1,000th of an inch. Now, that's really good in terms of finding defects on that order. The issue is what happens if there's a smaller defect? And these defects, when they grow exponentially, unfortunately. At least that's what a lot of the old testing data back in the 60s, and there's a current, the fracture mechanics side of things that kind of governs that. So what constitutes, it's more of a kind of layered approach for testing. For the pressure, so how do you kind of get rid of those smaller defects? How do you kind of make sure that they don't propagate in a way that over time they could become as big as a defect, 20 years down the line? This is where the kind of the pressure testing kind of comes in. Most people, when they think about pressure testing, it's like a fit up. Like, I did all the repair to a tank, I installed the service equipment, I'm going to push the tank a little bit higher in terms of normal operating pressure just to make sure that everything is not leaking. And that's typically one of the primary purposes of a pressure test. One of the secondary things that the pressure test does is when you're doing a pressure test, those small defects, that pressure test will try to rip those small defects apart. And you may think that's a bad thing. From the engineering sense, it's a good thing, because the hope is that once it starts ripping it apart, it will stop. And at that location, and only at that location, it gets stronger. So that's the weird thing about the fracture mechanics of this, the science of this, is that doing the pressure test will help solve that portion of the problem. So you may be wondering, well, why shouldn't I just go through the pressure testing? No. If it's so great in terms of the test, I should skip radiography and just do pressure testing. One of the issues, not all tests cover all the problems. One of the issues with just doing the pressure test is that if you have a defect that's within or embedded inside the metal, so like say within halfway the distance of the thickness of the metal, the pressure test isn't going to do anything to it. It is only going to be acting on the surface. That's the benefit. If it's embedded, it can't help. That's why UT is very good in trying to find all these defects. But as you kind of maybe know where I'm kind of leading is, if the defect's even small, it's embedded, how am I supposed to inspect? This is where the periodic inspections kind of roll in. And it's to track make sure that the defects inside aren't growing too big. And usually speaking, they grow pretty slow if they're embedded. But there's always that risk of it growing too fast and too furious. So that's why there's a periodic inspection for a pressure vessel. And this happens not just in the cargo tank world, but it happens like a lot of the stuff that I'm describing. It's a kind of layered approach in the nuclear industry, in the oil and gas industry, they do a lot of this, coupling. It's just to the degree of when to do the frequency of this inspection that's a little bit different. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yep. Next question. Can VTP tests be brought in-house and completed by the owners of the tanks? And if so, what credentials would that company need from a regulatory standpoint? Do you need to repeat the question?
No apologies. I was trying to find, we had a discussion on this very recently, so I went to pull it up and couldn't get back to the screen. So was one of those moments. So we did have a recent discussion about this in the regulations in 173.315, and Alex and Leonard jump in if I'm going to get anything wrong here, but 173.315, I'm scrolling down to it now on my screen so I can read it word for word what it says. 315M, there's J. Okay, 315M for the required testing. So keep in mind that what we're doing outside of this for the safety advisory is recommended. It is not required. So the recommended side of things, we can't say that those have to be done by someone who is certified in any way, although of course we recommend that, right? You need the experience to know what you're looking at. But for the tanks that are required to be tested, it does say in here in the regulation that each nurse tank has to be tested in accordance with 180.407. Each nurse tank has to be inspected and tested by a person meeting the requirements of 180.409, meaning they have to be a registered inspector and they do have to have the CT number issued by FMCSA. For the ones that are required to be tested. Go ahead, Leonard or Alex, any thoughts on the others, safety advisory or anything to add?
No, I think it's good.
Next question. Do you have a list of companies that provide the various testing options that would need to be done on tanks?
I'm guessing you might be referring more to the new types, the radiographic and ultrasonic that he's referring to. I will say you can always look up companies that have a CT number. We have, you can even Google search FMCSA find CT number. Our website that's safer, our safer website has a spot where you can search for those. So you can find the ones that would do the P, T, and V. Alex or Leonard, any thoughts on the ultrasonic and or the radiographic testing?
Yeah, we don't really have a list of companies. I'm not normally familiar with the list of companies that do UT and RT. So unfortunately on our side, we don't really have too much to add on that.
Next question. How could AWT manufacture defective tanks go by so long without being identified, and have steps been taken to prevent from happening again?
It's a good question. I keep saying that you all have great questions here. I will say we did do an investigation back in 2011 where we did identify that there were issues with the welds, and we developed a safety plan, and there had to be inspections done for a few years after that. And then I believe they got sold and went out of business and other things down the road. And we had hoped the issue was taken care of, but as these tanks age, we're seeing more and more problems with them. Since they're not a DOT specification cargo tank, we have to follow different criteria, which is why we went the safety advisory route. Leonard, Alex?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of this has to do with happening after the fact, because normally in the regular kind of cargo tank, or if you talk about a regulated industry, typically there's an a sort of like a inspection that happens before the tank gets put into service. Like normally they'll do a UT inspection on the welds. They will do a pressure testing. And unfortunately, I don't know if they did that for based on the manufacturing side. I assume they did because of the ASME requirements, but it's possible that they may not have done it. So it's kind of hard to know. But usually it happens afterwards that we find out that something was wrong with the manufacturing process.
It's when we hear about incidents and things happening that we can then go in and try to find the root cause and figure out where it came from exactly.
Right. We're pretty reactive in that essence, in that instance. So
next question, tanks that are manufactured today that are thinner than the minimum standards for VTP and are allowed to stay in service as long as they have the ASME data plate. Once the ASME data plate goes missing, the tank would fail the T-test, so they're automatically out of service, correct?
that's not necessarily the case. Again, it depends on the documentation. So from a the ASME registered inspector's perspective is if you have a documentation on that tank, even though it is less than what's specified currently for the illegible or the missing, if you have that documentation, the ASME inspector can put the plate back on. And as long as it doesn't go under the ASME minimum thickness, it should be fine. That's not the issue. One of the things is if it's missing and you don't have the documentation, it's a possibility that when they do the thickness test, yes, it's less. Then in that case, it's possible that the tank would be out of service.
Next question, I think it was Leonard that mentioned a nurse tank with a missing data plate cannot be repaired. Do you mean it cannot be repaired legally? What regulation would the person be in violation of? And would this apply to a small family farm who repaired it themselves?
The question is, the answer to that question is it cannot legally be repaired. 173-315 M2 subparagraph 5 prohibits well repairs.
Okay. Next question. We have nurse tanks that have been in service for 40+ years with legible data plates. Has anyone in DOT done testing for stress corrosion fractures on the older tanks?
I can say FMCSA is not going out and necessarily testing these, but we do have one of the Iowa universities, I'm sorry, I don't remember, it's Iowa State, Iowa, one of them has been doing a research study into stress corrosion cracking in these nurse tanks. And we do help, and FMCSA as well, we help to fund research when possible into these kinds of issues.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think in the reports that were issued by FMCSA, much of it had to do with when they were welding the tank, there was a lot of residual stresses. So I think they made a recommendation of doing heat treatment in the manufacturing process, which I think at least today's manufacturers have incorporated into their own process to kind of extend the life of the tank.
Next question. We had our tanks ultrasound tested, repaired, ultrasound tested again, hydro tested, have had national board come sign off on repairs, have the R1 forms, U1A forms, national board job traveler forms, NTIP reports, anything else they should keep on file?
I think that's pretty much all the documentation that you can have.
One attendee says Acuren is a company that does the ultrasonic testing. Another says SF Welding and Repair also does that. I correct me if I'm wrong, panelists. I don't think that FMCSA or FMCSA or the federal government stamps approval on certain companies, as I don't think y'all are in the business of picking winners and losers in that space, but um, uh, would state regulatory agencies know of companies that provide testing options for nurse tanks?
That's always a good place to start with your state regulatory agencies. Also, your local ag associations, as we're aware, being in this group too, might have some resources for your local state ag association. There's at least one in most of these Midwest states out here. They might have some good information. And you are correct. We are legally not allowed to recommend one company over another.
That's what I figured. Okay. The next question we have here, and it's the last question. So if you do have a question, we've got a couple more minutes here. Feel free to send it in. Would ASME or the National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors have information on obtaining a new data plate for a nurse tank?
Again, much of it would have to come from the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer's still in business, the ASME's inspector can reach out, or you can reach out to the manufacturer to see if they still have, if it's an old tank, information on that particular nurse tank design. And if they do, it should be, in my view, pretty readily easy to put the data plate on. The issue is if your manufacturer's out of business, that becomes more problematic. Unless you've kept good records yourselves, it's maybe not possible, because I find it hard for an ASME inspector to put a data plate on for a tank that he or she doesn't know who designed it and to what calculations are, or the testing that was done.
And when it comes to the national board, they do keep record of anything that has a U1A report in general, but that's just paperwork. They do not, it's my understanding anyway, that they don't keep copies of the plates. They just keep information related to that U1A report.
Two other messages. One says NBIC Part 2 explains the steps to obtain and replace a nameplate. Another attendee says most nurse tank manufacturers are no longer in business for tanks still in service. I don't know how correct or incorrect that is, but as we're getting ready to close the webinar for today, I want to thank Jessica and Alex and Leonard for their time. For the folks at FMCSA and FMCSA and the Department of Transportation, we appreciate your willingness to come on and speak to the Agricultural Retailers Association. Once again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available to ARA members, and will be behind the member-only section of the ARA website. If you do not have a login for that website, please email info@aradc.org to set one up. And once again, I will leave the slide up for a few more minutes that has the QR codes for those regulations and the contact information for these public servants here with us today. Appreciate all of your time and want to thank you again for your willingness to sit down and speak with our ag retailers today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
One last question. My perception is that we are sitting on a ticking time bomb with some of these nurse tanks. We have no idea how safe these older tanks are. Is that a correct assumption? I'm not sure how far folks want to go on this call. ARA has been involved in this issue for many years now. When these things pop up, we always tell our members to err on the side of precaution. If you have not gotten testing done, you might consider doing so. I know some of our members, particularly those in the Midwest, are doing this voluntarily. It's always, in our opinion, a good course of action to do this while it's voluntary, so that you're not required to do it later, in the interest of safety of your employees, the safety of the public around your facilities. ARA strongly suggests you go through with the process, but we do not have a firm policy on our members going through this issue. We allow the autonomy of each individual company to figure out what's best course of action for you. But again, some great resources here, and would suggest you reach out to them if you have issues or want questions answered on this subject. So again, thanks for everybody for your participation, and we'll give you back a few more minutes of your day. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.